Ora bem, como prometido, vamos falar aqui um bocado da palhaçada da Nvidia, porque a palhaçada da Nvidia não para. Drivers novos. Eu ia fazer um vídeo sobre os drivers novos. Era preto, tive que reiniciar o PC. Não estava com 4, sei de falar, mas se calhar depois falam disso. Mas há assuntos bem mais importantes a falar. Como dá para ver aí, RTX 5060 de 8 GB, a palhaçada continua e era para pôr um outro título, que é a Nvidia está a fazer cambalache ainda pior, é outro termo. O Gamers Nexus diz que eles estão a fazer manipulação suja, e eu acho que até é outra palavra até mais importante. Ok? Vamos então, para não perdermos aqui muito tempo. Deixa-me ver se eu consigo instalar aqui o meu coisinho. Não sei porque é que eu desliguei o cachorrinho. Isto que aconteceu foi a Nvidia lançou então esta nova gráfica, a 5060, a saber que a maior parte dos streamers iam estar na Computex. Portanto, os streamers com mais relevo mundial, e a esses streamers não lhes forneceu as gráficas e proibiu os próprios partners de fornecerem gráficas às pessoas, aos youtubers mais conhecidos. E depois, os que aceitaram tiveram que fazer um acordo com eles, ok? Do que é que eles tinham que falar, o que é que eles não podiam comparar, portanto, não vão poder comparar com gráficas da AMD, e as gráficas que vão poder comparar é com a série 2000, série 3000 e em coisas específicas de inteligência artificial e as aplicações que eles escolheram, ok? Global Data já tem esta gráfica. Se vocês quiserem comprar, está aqui, excelente. Faça upgrade para uma GPU Nvidia 5060 para desfrutar mais. Mas isto aqui eu aceito, porque é uma loja e a loja está cá para trabalhar, ok? Tudo isto que aqui está é tudo vergonha. Isto que aqui está, isto não são os FPS, ok? Isto é usar aquela coisa que eles querem implementar cá fora, o Super Resolution. Isto é uma treta. A maior parte dos jogos vocês têm que usar o Nvidia Inspector para poder ativar isso. Dá uma confusão tremenda. Mas enfim, tirando essa parte aí, o que é que eles têm? A gráfica conseguem comprar a mais barata, é por 329,90. Ok? Uma gráfica de 2025 é de 8 GB. Ok, mas 8 GB é uma gráfica para este preço. Não, vocês vão ver os benchmarks dela. Meu Deus, ok? Meu Deus. Claro que para este preço, se não tens gráfica nenhuma, se tens uma gráfica muito inferior, é óbvio, né? Mas se vais substituir, pensa duas vezes, ok? Enfim, o driver que eu estou a falar foi este, o que saiu hoje, ok? 576.52. E eu tive o ecrã preto quando o instalei, ok? Depois eu vou falar nisso outro dia, talvez. Não interessa. Vamos começar aqui por das pessoas que eu também sigo. Eu vou tirar aqui.
25 from Taipei, Taiwan is brought to you by frustrated and highly critical recap of the Nvidia keynote here at Computex 2025. We're in Taipei, Taiwan, and I wanted things to be kind of normal for this week because I love coming to Computex. I love hearing about the new technology. And usually when Nvidia announces new graphics cards or a new graphics card, specifically the RTX 5060 is what was announced briefly in today's keynote, followed by lots and lots of AI slop because that's where Nvidia truly makes their money these days. But normally, Nvidia might invite press to a pre-briefing to give us some information on what's coming out, then they do their keynote, and then we would post our videos saying, hey, here's what they announced, here are the specs, here's the price, $300 for the RTX 5060 8GB, which we were already aware of, and then we might do a little bit of light pre-analysis based on those specs, indicating what we expect to.
A Nvidia fez um acordo com os gajos. Acordo não, obrigou. Se queres ter esta gráfica e fazer os testes antes dos outros grandes, vais ter que seguir o nosso plano.
Performance to be, whether we think it's going to be a good card or a good value or a bad card with poor value. If you've been following the tech world, and especially Nvidia GPUs for the past few years, and in fact going back 5 to 10 plus years, they have been engaged in a long-term strategy to gradually increase the perceived value of their GPUs by engaging in marketing techniques like price anchoring, as well as pretty much the removal of the lowest tier of graphics cards, that entry-level price between $150 and $200 or so. They simply haven't been producing GPUs that fit within that category, and GPUs that previously would have fallen in that category, they are rebadging as RTX 5060 and 70 tier class cards, even when it's very apparent, looking at the base specs of these cards, that they would have fallen into lower price and lower tier categories if it was 5 years or more ago. But it's very possible that you are already aware of a lot of this, because I and many of my tech media cohorts have been vociferously complaining about this for some time. And I think our hope was that Nvidia might take some of our criticisms into account and maybe even adjust the way that they're addressing certain things like multi-frame generation to make it more evident to the end user, to the gamers out there, especially those who are not as familiar with a lot of the underlying technologies like DLSS4 and multi-frame generation, that generated frames are not equivalent to natively rendered frames by the game engine. I do think that multi-frame generation has its place, like DLSS, which has advanced over time and become pretty ubiquitous and something that lots of gamers use to enhance performance. Multi-frame generation introduces latency and creates frames that might not necessarily be a representation of what's happening in the game. So I've said before that I think it's appropriate for single-player immersive titles to increase the smoothness of gameplay, but Nvidia, in their briefing to the press, immediately doubled down on this false equivalency with this slide. RTX 5060, your favorite games maxed out 100 plus FPS. This angers and frustrates me because it immediately takes away my ability to offer an objective assessment of the benefits of frame gen, multi-frame gen, especially the 4X frame gen that they now have with the RTX 50 series. And these charts are just manipulative, deceptive on the highest level. Sure, in the footnotes down at the bottom they say, using the best version of frame gen available for that graphics card, but the 50 series are the only cards that can do 4X frame gen. So any card 40 series, 30 series or below is going to be severely held back by the lack of frame gen. That is if, of course, you're counting generated frames as real frames, which you shouldn't be doing, and we shouldn't be doing, and Nvidia shouldn't be doing for that matter. But wait, it gets worse, and this is the true rub for me right now. If you watched the most recent episode of Tech News, you know that Nvidia is not allowing reviewers access to a driver in order to produce reviews for the RTX 5060 8GB prior to its launch on the 19th, which is today. This card is going up for sale with no independent reviews for it aside...
Este vídeo, este que está aqui, eu tenho aqui, tudo bem, Pedro? Aqui, a ver? Eles não forneceram os drivers, ok? Portanto, tu não vais poder fazer os benchmarks que normalmente se faz e vais ter que usar os benchmarks que eles mandam-te fazer, ok? Que são os sintéticos. Isto não interessa para nada, ok? Isto não interessa para nada. E as ordens que a própria Nvidia deu foi que os fornecedores das marcas, tipo por exemplo a ASUS, Gigabyte, MSI, não podiam mandar para certos youtubers conhecidos, porque eles pegam nesta gráfica e fazem aqueles testes pesados e conseguem mostrar tudo que é para eles ficarem mal, não é? Portanto, vamos então aqui para o vídeo do Hardware Unbox, já sabem. É um dos mais conceituados aqui do mundo de informática. Estou um bocado admirado pelo Linux ainda não ter falado nada disso. Então, vamos aqui começar.
Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. We're here in Taipei for Computex 2025 and, well, we woke up this morning and we saw some pretty disappointing things occurring in the media relating to the...
Atenção, o outro vídeo já o fiz, já está no canal, ok? Foi do início da Computex. E mostrei aqui a apresentação da Nvidia. Começou logo por o CEO fazer uma mentira brutal e dizer que eles pegaram nesta gráfica, que é a tal 5060, e meteu-a no portátil. Não, os componentes dos portáteis são componentes diferentes dos PCs de secretário, mas tudo bem. Fanboy acredita em tudo.
GeForce RTX 5060, which, as you all know, is launching in the next couple of days. There's just been some odd preview coverage and that sort of thing, so we wanted to get in front of the camera and just talk about, I guess Nvidia's
Eles vão falar aquilo que eu já falei há bocadito. Portanto, a Nvidia tentou renegociar. Eles já aqui uns anos atrás tiveram um problema grave com a Nvidia, e porque a Nvidia queria-os obrigar a eles a falarem do Ray Tracing, e no tempo que o Ray Tracing nem a gráfica topo de gama fazia isso. E eles recusaram-se, e a Nvidia começou a retirar-lhe de apoio em muita coisa. O Gamers Nexus ainda vem falar coisas bem piores, e até mete uma faca na Nvidia e diz: atenção que eu também tenho comunicações entre vocês, portanto e-mails e aquelas coisas todas, do que é que vocês queriam que eu fizesse para vocês me mandarem a gráfica e os drivers para fazer este teste. Portanto, cuidado, que no caso, por exemplo, nos Estados Unidos, são coisas gravíssimas, ok? Gravíssimas.
manipulation of the media when it comes to previews and review coverage, why you shouldn't be using previews of the RTX 5060 to buy.
Pedro, não sei o que é que tu queres dizer com isso. Porque é que a pessoa quer 220 FPS? Eu não sei. Ou não conheces nada de gaming, ou caíste aqui de paraquedas.
This specific GPU and why we strongly believe you should still wait for reviews, which is going to be difficult because, you know, we're here in Taipei and we're going to talk a little bit about that. And yeah, just this is a long-running situation that Nvidia has been implementing for a while now. So we're going to give a little bit of a history into it and yeah, just really talk about how it relates to the RTX 5060.
The Hardware Unboxed Computex coverage is brought to you by MSI, Thermal Grizzly, G-Skill and Trix. Check out MSI's range of X870 and B850 motherboards built.
Se vocês quiserem ver tudo, vão lá diretamente a eles.
Questionable decisions that have been made over the years. But what stands out to me as sort of I don't know if a turning point is the right word, but a point where this started to occur, this manipulation of reviews, most notably would have been probably the RTX 3080 release, which really unnecessary.
Já começou há muito tempo atrás, com outros assuntos.
Baby step. And we don't really want to name too many names here. In this example, Digital Foundry were granted early access to look at the RTX 3080 and sort of a preview review style. I think it was a few days before the actual reviews were set to go live, which they did. So in this particular example, it wasn't terribly egregious, but it was still an attempt to manipulate the initial impressions of the product. So in their instance, they were only allowed to benchmark at 4K, comparing the RTX 3080 with the 2080. Now this led to a best case scenario showing typically around an 80% performance uplift. I think they saw about 77% on average, which wasn't that much above what you see when comparing those two GPUs at 4K. It's around the 70% mark across a wide range of games. So not miles off, but at 1440p, the RTX 3080 wasn't nearly as impressive relative to the 2080 for numerous reasons, and that's still true to this day. We're looking at just shy of a 50% performance uplift on average. So if the initial impression was you're looking at, let's say 48% uplift at 1440p, and that's probably a resolution that most gamers were focused on, it's a lot less exciting than 80%. But again, it's not a horrible example. It wasn't terribly misleading, which is why I think most people were happy with it and it didn't raise too many eyebrows at the time.
It didn't really need to be done, odd choice, and it was very much using the strong reputation that Digital Foundry has built up over the years to basically say exactly what Nvidia has wanted to say through them. So
I wasn't particularly happy with that coverage at the time. Again, don't really want to call Digital Foundry out on that. I think looking back, their content was fine. Definitely showed a best case scenario, but it wasn't miles difference to what reality was. So not a huge problem there. And again, it just didn't need to happen on Nvidia's side. Got even weirder, though probably more well, I don't want to say justified, but it got weirder with the RTX 3090. That's where the whole 8K meme began. And again, they lent on the reputation of multiple well-known, in a lot of instances, trusted media outlets to push the narrative that the RTX 3090 was a product worth buying because it was very future-proof. It was going to support 8K TVs and upcoming gaming monitors and things like that and offer an experience that you just couldn't get on any other GPU. Again, it turned out to be more of the 8K meme. No one really bought that, but they attempted
8K,
to,
ok.
again, manipulate
E
the,
depois mal
the
se joga
messaging there
4K.
with sort of early access to this
Mas a malta
8K
acredita
focused
nisso.
content. So we'll sort of fast forward. I think we'll mostly skip the GeForce 40 series and just jump pretty much to the present so we don't drag this out too much. So with the release of the RTX 5070, again, days before those reviews were set to go live, we just out of nowhere saw a series of previews pop up claiming, that it was an amazing gaming experience and it offered huge performance gains, 5070 faster than a 4090 type stuff. It was really parroting those Nvidia marketing talking points. And that, again, was a couple of days before the real independent reviews were set to go live. Now, unclear if this content was paid for or not, or it was sort of
Claro que foi.
throwing certain
Eles estão
media
com
outlets
medo de
a bone.
falar
If you
muitas das
play nice
coisas.
with us, we'll shower you in views for the early access content. So easy content to make and good views.
So I think we need to be clear here what the difference is between a review and a preview, because you might be wondering, what is the difference? If they've got early access, surely they can just make anything that they want to make in that preview period. But
Mas
really,
o truque está aí.
with the reviews, the day one reviews that we would cover, Gamers Nexus, all the independent outlets, there's no restrictions on what we can talk about with the
Essa é
products
que é a
at all.
questão.
So we can basically say anything we want to say. We don't sign anything that says that we have to cover certain things.
Isso é que eu
We're just
também
giving
digo,
our
no
honest
jogo
opinions
nunca
on the
comprei
product. And we're
beta.
adhering to the NDA so that everyone gets a fair go at
Salve
making their
final,
content
e
at the
mesmo
same
assim-
time. So there's no rush to get content out and that sort of thing. With previews, though, usually there is a document that you sign and agree to get that early access ahead of the review date. So when it comes to a preview, there might be a number of dot points saying, well, you have to test at this resolution, or you have to test these games, or you have to test these configurations.
Olha,
and
eu
it
acho
will be very
que estes
specific
youtubers
about
deviam se
providing
juntar,
certain
os que não
configurations that
aceitam
are
a
favourable
questão
to
das
the product
previews, e
that is
publicar
being tested, which is why in the
vídeo em
case of that
conjunto,
5070 content,
tipo uma live,
there was a lot of
assim, dizer
focus
assim, ó,
on
este canal,
configurations that wouldn't
este
see the
canal,
VRAM
fizeram
buffer
tudo
was
antes
very favourable with
do
frame
lançamento
generation and that
oficial,
sort of thing, which
portanto
may
são
not have
todos
been the focus
previews.
of the independent reviews
Ok?
that you would have
Simples.
seen a couple of days
Simples.
later.
They almost always
Eu
do
hoje já
include
encontrei
radio
dois,
on
um
GPUs,
canal
so
brasileiro
ignores the competition, which
e outro é um canal,
that's one of the
não sei
main
se ele é
criteria of
australiano.
paid content is no competing products. So we just want to show people who have invested in our products before a clear path to upgrade. So why you should be incentivized to upgrade to this new product we're releasing. In the example of the RTX 5070, the friendly media outlets that we're aware of that made some coverage was Gamers Radar and PC Gamer. Both of those were chosen. Gamers Radar, their title for their content piece was, I've been using the RTX 5070 to play a bunch of games.
Este está a mostrar
and it might
alguns
be
dos que
the
apareceram a
console
fazer
killing
isso.
GPU I've been waiting for. Kind of a nothing title there, but
Mas
it
isto
would have
é
been the
malta que
testing
nem
that was a
sequer é
bit
conhecida.
unusual. A lot of multi-frame generation
Quem é que
on
vai?
versus off on previous generations, showing very
Estes são
skewed
canais
results.
de milhões, Gamers
PC
Nexus,
Gamer,
Box,
their
Linux.
title read NVIDIA RTX 5070 hands-on preview, a sneak peek at my unreleased RTX Blackwell card hitting triple-digit frame rates in Cyberpunk 2077 at 1440p and avowed at 4K. And of course, they were again testing with multi-frame generation enabled on the Blackwell GPU, so the GeForce 50 series GPU, the 5070, and then no multi-frame generation on the previous generation that doesn't support it. So big old skewed graphs with data that makes it seem like the GeForce 50
E
series
as pessoas
is a
caem
far more
nesta
significant
coisa,
upgrade than
comparar
it really
uma
is.
série
At least
5000
with those
com
previews,
série
you were
3000
able
ou
to
série
see
2000
independent
que não
review
tem
coverage
frame
within a couple of
generation.
days. Like these previews were released ahead of time, but within a few days and still ahead of the launch of the 5070, the actual retail launch, you were able to get the full independent picture, which covered a whole bunch of scenarios and wasn't just the Nvidia
Deixem pôr
games
isto
that they
mais
thought were the
rápido,
most
porque assim
favourable
vocês não
scenario.
perdem muito tempo.
So as you can sort of see, we've gone from the 3080 launch back in the day where, a couple of examples were used, but were generally somewhat reflective of the products, to then with this current generation, we've got the 5070, a bit more of that sort of preview, misleading numbers, frame generation, to now what we think is clearly the worst example we have seen of this media manipulation, the RTX 5060 and the previews that we woke up to this morning. And again, like the preview coverage was exactly the same really as the 5070 in the structure, the examples that Nvidia wanted people to use. So 1080p gaming,
muita
is the
gente
5060 supposed to be a
está a
1080p
achar
card,
os
lots of
300
multi-frame
euros
generation
barato.
examples, and specifically, 4x frame gen on versus no frame gen with
Mas enquanto
3060s and
está a
2060s, for
falar,
example. We've seen some pretty egregious charts that show highly
aqui uma
misleading,
coisa.
inflated numbers there. And so there's all of that. There's all of that angle. You're getting a preview a couple of days ahead of launch. that has misleading numbers. But this is compounded by the fact that there's no review program for the 5060. There's no independent coverage of this product. At least it's going to be enabled before launch, because we still, as we sit here today, do not have driver access for the 5060. So with 5070, you got reviews. You would have gotten reviews just before launch. With the 5060, we do not have driver access. And the only way to have gotten driver access for the 5060 is to opt in to this review program.
Yeah, that's right. So in summary, the way this story is developed is many weeks ago now, prior to the RTX 5060 Ti reviews, we had a private meeting with Nvidia where essentially they were they didn't tell us, essentially they revealed that they were bearing the 8 GB versions. So the 5060 Ti 8 GB and the 5060, no real review program for those. Don't worry about those. So we're bearing them without bearing them. So obviously we managed to get a 5060 Ti 8 GB. We've now provided content on that. The 5060, they didn't really mention, they just said when that becomes available in May, you guys can get your hands on one and test it, and you're free to make your reviews. And when we pressed them a bit more on that, it seems like there definitely wasn't a review program. It was unclear when we'd be able to get one, but they'll just appear on shelves, and when they do, we can review one. So not great. Then that story evolved into, we're now releasing it during the Computex trade show. So while all the tech media is out trying to cover the biggest tech trade show of the year, this card will appear on shelves and you'll be able to buy it and review it then, except we're in Computex, or in Taiwan, attending Computex. So can't do that. And although we were able to get our hands on cards weeks ago, Nvidia were withholding the driver. So that means we couldn't get access to the required driver ahead of time to produce our review before we came here to Taiwan, so it could go out on the 20th. So as a result, yeah, we're not going to have a review on the 20th, and probably won't have one shortly after, though. We're working on a few things there. So anyway, that's the situation. But as Tim said, making it even worse, now we have the previews, but the previews won't be followed by reviews. Except for the outlets that got the preview driver, so the more friendly media outlets that were basically agreed to doing these highly questionable previews and now able to provide reviews. So probably not going to be the most critical RTX 5060 reviews you're going to come across, but could be wrong on that one, but I'm sure some of them will be much more friendly than what you'd see from the likes of Gamers Nexus or us, as an example.
Yeah, there's really been no example in the history so far up until this point where Nvidia's made such a concerted effort to bury what we think is a very mainstream product. Like, there's certainly been products, more niche examples like 3050 6GB come to mind more recently, 3080 12GB as well, where they're just released onto the market. There's not been much review access or anything. They're just released. You have to test it at some point later. The 5060 though, that is the 60 series card. It's not we're not talking about a version of the 5060 that's like a specific, maybe worse version, downclocked or down configured version of the card. This is the 5060 that lots of people will be buying. And so to go through with a preview program, which again, it kind of establishes content on the internet that if you search for the 5060, the first things that will be coming up around the time you're buying the cards are going to be the preview content. And then the first trickling out of those reviews, as you were saying, from the outlets that did.
So
some important details for these previews that you guys are seeing. They had to agree to quite strict guidelines in order to receive the driver, and they had to create this preview content. So it wasn't like, oh yeah, send us the driver, we might do something with it, and then you're able to make the review. You really had to agree to these terms and conditions with Nvidia. So that's what's happened here. And there's half a dozen or so media outlets that have agreed to this that we've seen previews from so far. So GameStar, Games Radar, Tom's Guide, JV Tech, and ASCII2, which I believe is a Japanese publication. So the guidelines state, as far as we can tell, that it can only be compared, so this is the RTX 5060, can only be compared with the RTX 3060 and the 2060 Super. Now, I did see one comparison out of...
A ver, eles só podem testar a 5060 com uma 3060 ou uma 2060 Super. Estas duas gráficas não têm o Super Resolution. Eu vou dizer. Depois só podem jogar nestes aqui, nestes jogos que estão aqui. Depois settings, resolution 1080p. Graphic setting are fixed. A crucial factor is wireless 50 can utilize quadruple multiplayer generator. All the GPUs don't allow additional frames to generator. Aí, só que depois ele pode pôr então a 5060 4 vezes, não é? Os frames, e as outras não. Claro que vai ter uma diferença brutal em termos de performance, mas o que é que um gajo vai...
One of these that did look at the RTX 4060, so I'm not 100% sure whether they broke the guidelines or what, but in any case, they weren't allowed to compare with Radeon GPUs or anything like that, and they really didn't go out of their way to handpick the cards that would probably make the 5060, well, certainly the testing makes the 5060 look better than it was, but they're trying to target people obviously with these older cards and entice them into upgrading.
That's being generous. I think the clear reason is the 3060 and 2060 Super do not support frame generation of any kind. So they're clearly trying to show, well, 4x frame gen, 4x multi-frame gen, that the 5060 supports compared to no frame generation. And if you include the 4060, you have at least single frame generation. So by specifically including 3060 versus 5060, you're getting the largest difference between generations enabled by multi-frame generation.
Which is what the graphs from these media outlets show. They're showing 3 times more performance out of a 5060 or more than that, which is crazy. So, but again, that's, as Tim pointed out, frame generation, which I was about to get to. So well, I'll go to the games tested first. So the games tested are Avowed, Doom of the Dark Ages, Marvel Rivals, Cyberpunk 2077, and Hogwarts Legacy. I don't think there's anything too crazy. Of course, Cyberpunk's in there, but the games tested, fine, whatever. I mean, they're all perfectly fine games to include, especially when you're only comparing GeForce GPUs with GeForce GPUs. Don't really have too much of a problem with the games list. I mean, probably not wrapped that there's a games list to begin with and you can't just test it however you'd like to. But it's the settings that are the big problem here. So 8GB GPU, and therefore the testing has been limited to 1080p. Ultra settings though, which is an interesting choice, but with DLSS quality upscaling. So you're at 1080p with quality upscaling, and then if there's ray tracing, ray reconstruction, or path tracing, that's to be turned on when available. And then of course, multi-frame generation. So you could end up with a scenario where about 20 frames per second, 30 frames per second, but because using multi-frame generation, the performance looks very good, and the other GPUs will be well unusable. So again, as Tim said, I said it incentivizes you to upgrade, but it just shows extremely skewed data that is in no way realistic or representative of real-world performance. It's really just blank benchmark graphs. So that's the goal there. And really, they're trying to work out how to get their own marketing slides into mainstream media. So there's been a big push. We've been targeted with it in the past to test with DLSS, stuff like frame generation enabled.
And it's an attempt to legitimize the misleading marketing. They're using the reputation that these sites have in terms of producing independent testing and saying, well, we want you to essentially copy the marketing and put it into a different format that makes it look like you've come to that as an independent conclusion, which isn't necessarily the case because, again, there are guidelines that would be listing these testing configurations.
In summary there, or our opinion on this is the previews are very bad, should not be done under any circumstances. There's really no justification for any of these media outlets doing these previews. You should never create content following any company's guidelines, especially when there's strict guidelines like that. So it's damaging, shouldn't be done, very poor practice, and there's really no defending it. Yeah, I think that's fair to say. You agree with that?
Yeah,
it's bad.
You're becoming the marketing arm of the company. It's even if it's not a paid-for piece, it's effectively SponCon, like sponsored content.
Well, they're getting paid in one way or another. So why would you take such a deal? Well, you get views. You get easy views. Views is money. So if you're a struggling site or need to pay the bills, taking that kind of deal might seem like a good idea. It definitely isn't. You should definitely not do it. But that's how it boils down to money, is views. That's the currency there. Also, not peeing off Nvidia, probably something that a lot of these, media outlets don't want to do because it risks, views. So they don't get review samples, they can't cover the products, they don't get included in early access. So for example, Nvidia never approached us about doing an early preview on the RTX 5060 because they will know our answer on that one. So they didn't even bother approaching us. But there are other media outlets that are friendlier and will do that sort of stuff. But they should definitely not do it.
Well, yeah, it's also, sites of our size, Hardware Unboxed, Gamers Nexus, Linus, there's many different ways that we can get review GPUs and cards, and we have many contacts in the industry and we're well established. So it's much harder to prevent us from doing a review. Whereas one of the things we've been really concerned about with this in the past has been the impact it has on smaller channels where they're more reliant on Nvidia directly providing the GPUs and hardware that they test.
It's not just to put in the day one reviews, it's actually to get the product. So we can afford to buy RTX 5090s if we need to or whatever. Again, Gamers Nexus, same sort of position. But if you're just starting out, you don't have those kind of budgets. You can't just go buy an RTX 5090 and then an RTX 5080 and then a 5070 Ti. You're talking about tens of thousands of dollars in most currencies just to review a product line. But we can do that, which is sort of the...
Nvidia knows this, and they use this information to push out previews to these specific outlets and things, knowing that they might have a better chance of running the marketing angles on those channels as opposed to a larger channel where we've got more options. And that's just really tactics that it's very disappointing to see. Like, I don't like smaller channels being put into that position. Like,
well, we were a smaller channel put in that position.
Yeah, it's a poor position to be put into where you're sort of tossing up, do I do this potentially dodgy content or do I lose out on my revenue stream, my livelihood, because I don't have the cards that I need to do my job? It's not good.
Yeah, well, early on in the creation of our channel, we decided we weren't going to work directly in terms of sponsorships, so receive money from AMD, Intel, or Nvidia. the core of our content was going to be focused around those 3 companies. So we just thought, don't deal with them at all directly, so they have nothing over us and they can't manipulate us in any way. That was a decision we made very early on, and of course we've stuck to that. And the channel was much smaller back in, it was 2019. So the initial RTX release, we covered DLSS. Tim found it wasn't very good, said so. The initial ray tracing promise, not very good, didn't live up to it. We said so. We weren't just repeating NVIDIA's marketing saying, you want your games to be ray traced, you want this, you want that, these cards are amazing. We were like, the value is not really here at this point in time. NVIDIA made it clear to us they were very unhappy with that opinion and that content, and they wanted to change our opinion on that. Something we haven't talked about in the main channel for various reasons. October 2019, I had a private meeting with a few NVIDIA representatives in Australia. They flew out from the US. And again, they made it known they weren't happy with our content, what we were doing. We weren't including enough DLSS benchmarks. We weren't including enough ray tracing benchmarks, which, I disagreed with because I thought we were showing the technologies really as they were for gamers. Anyway, long story short, over an hour of trying to beat me down on these points and being unsuccessful, they essentially turned around and said, how much can we pay you? So they wanted us to make a DLSS content piece and include DLSS and reviews. They essentially said, we can sponsor you. We can help you guys out. We can throw money your way and do that. And I just flat out refused and said, no, we don't take money from Nvidia, AMD, Intel. They weren't happy with that. They seemed a bit shocked that we were not, we turned down money. They probably weren't expecting that. Yeah. And that was the end of the conversation. I think from that point, they didn't really see a way forward with us. So it was about a year later that we were reviewing the GeForce 30 series. RTX 3060 Ti reviews were coming up, and we'd heard nothing. No partners were really talking with us. Any partners that were talking with us said, you need to talk to NVIDIA. Shortly after, we got the email, which a lot of you will be familiar with, the change your editorial direction email that created a huge controversy and quite baffling that situation ever occurred. But basically, they couldn't pay us to do what they wanted us to do, so they attempted to remove us from the GeForce review program. So we're familiar with these tactics, and we're aware this has been going on for a long time. The reason why I didn't film a video straight after our private meeting was because it was a private meeting. The people I had the meeting with are no longer at NVIDIA, most of them. The person that offered me the money is no longer with NVIDIA. They've moved on. But it was a private meeting. There was no evidence that this really took place, and therefore it wasn't really worth making a content piece. I think we discussed it on our private Patreon live stream and stuff like that. We're a bit more transparent there. Then we've seen how the tactics change, and they are definitely doing these sort of tactics actively right now to other media. They're trying to strong arm them into these multi-frame generation graphs and stuff like that. We're aware that's going on. They haven't done that with us. They generally just provide us with the samples at this point in time and leave us alone, so which we appreciate. That's great. But what we don't appreciate is managing to source products like an RTX 5060 weeks in advance. We have plenty of time to provide you guys with an independent review showing you how the card performs, its strengths and weaknesses, and them actively barring us from doing so. And then, to add insult to injury, they're doing these really dodgy previews, and then the people who do the really dodgy previews are then rewarded with the only people that are allowed to provide a review. So that's a very bad situation.
Yeah, that's right. And so ultimately, I think our conclusion is very, very simple on this one. Don't buy the RTX 5060 at this point. Don't buy it until there are proper independent reviews produced from this card. And this is going to be a much more difficult situation than previous times. There's been previous sort of manipulation because of what we talked about previously, the lack of everyone being here in Taipei, basically, trying to cover other things, being unable to test the product. And yeah, we just want a video like this so people can understand exactly what's going on with RTX 5060 and sort of not just leave all that content there, like not just leave all the previews, have that be the only thing that's related to the 5060 out there. We just want a bit more transparency on that situation, and to be very, very clear that there's absolutely no way that you should be buying this product based on preview coverage and the marketing materials that you would have seen so far from NVIDIA specifically. And again, I'm going to say hopefully NVIDIA, by exposing this, won't do it again. But earlier in the video, we showed a pretty clear timeline where NVIDIA over time has been getting more aggressive with preview type coverage and trying to manipulate reviewers and independent media into doing what NVIDIA wants. So
I think the most concerning part as well is every example we can point to, it's gotten worse.
And a lot of these things have been talked about at the time. Like there were responses to that 8K videos, videos that were made pointing out how ludicrous they were. There were responses to things like, the 4080 12GB being highly misleading. There were responses to, there were just independent reviews for the 5070 like a couple of weeks later. And then obviously lots of reviewers have been talking about the multi-frame generation stuff and all those sorts of things in an accurate way. So the fact that all of that's happened, we keep bringing up like, NVIDIA's trying to bury 8GB GPUs even though they're still making them. And then the next tactic after that is 5060, bury that, then do these
Tem
previews.
aqui, por exemplo,
What are we going to be facing
70
next
contra
generation? Like
50,
if Nvidia
70,
is not confident that
50,
reviews
70,
are going to be positive, which I think that's a
e
really key part
depois
of these
tem
discussions, is
aqui
Nvidia
a
doesn't seem very
1080p,
confident in these products. They don't seem to
com
believe that they're
volume,
good,
que
so
é um
they're
jogo
needing to do more manipulation. If they
bom,
release another
muito bom.
series that is
E depois tem
bad,
aqui
then what's actually going to see? Are we
a
going to see
versão
even more bearing of GPUs? Is
da
that going to be for
50,
higher
60
end products as
Ti
well? Are they going
de
to
8 GB,
focus
que
more
também
on
já,
delivering
acho que já
content to
mostrei
media
aqui, não é?
platforms that are favorable to Nvidia and leaving out people who are more
Tentar tirar o
independent
som
in their
daqui.
thoughts?
Ok.
It's not a good situation to be in. But again, like we sort of said, we can highlight this issue and then it's probably just going to get worse next time. So
I think the
que
issue
é
is
quase
becoming increasingly
comparada
time sensitive. I really think that
com
gamers
a
need to let
Arc, né?
Nvidia know they're not happy about this, more so than they
Tá
have
tão
been,
má.
because they're really refining this process. And it's possibly not too far off
tá
a
aqui.
future where Gamers Nexus
E
Hardware
este
Box
é-
are reviews. Either we don't have
É o
them
modelo TI,
or they're heavily buried,
atenção.
because it's not difficult for
Mas se
Nvidia
quiser
to
vão
promote
aqui
these
ver.
previews. It's really not difficult for them to
Mas eu
boost
acho que há aqui outros.
these previews up when you search for content to make them bury everything else.
And if they see good results from doing that, then they are disincentivized over time from providing the review, drivers or hardware to people that, again, are not following the
aqui.
Nvidia script. If they're seeing that people are believing
versão TI
reviews from
também.
those sort of sources and thinking, oh, well, I don't need to watch a review from someone else because I've already got all the information from a preview, then they're going to be like, well,
Acho
we've
que
already
aqui
given, we've already done the reviews. They're done. Like,
preto
all
no
good.
branco,
So no need
as
to go any
diferenças
further
de
than that.
performance.
And again, like we're not sitting here. I don't want to sit here and whine and complain like, oh, we're
sei.
not going to get reviews, not be able to do not going to get review samples or whatever.
Vejam os
But I
vídeos
think
deles.
it goes to the an independent
Subscrevam.
review is necessary to
Eles
critically
merecem.
evaluate products. It's essential
merecem.
in markets like this, so that at the end of the day, consumers are getting the best
Depois
advice.
vamos ter
They're not
o
wasting money on products that are
Warzone
unnecessary.
box.
And
Não
the
hoje,
media is just
amanhã
essential
ou
for that
depois.
process. And any attempts to, I don't know, manipulate that, go around things is just not what we want to see.
We've also started using Trix coolers, and I've got to say the Panorama SE 360 Black is one of the stopped from Nvidia, and again, it's looking like they're wanting to head in the other direction with it. So anyway, that's really all we've got to say right.
Ok. Eles são todos na Computex, né? Já sabem. Já fiz o vídeo 2 a falar nisso. E a Nvidia tentou lançar a gráfica para esconder, pôs apenas os pessoas combinadas entre eles, que são os chamados, que fazem os chamados previews, com acordo escrito, só podiam testar com gráficas que não têm frame generation, portanto modelos da série 3000 e da série 2000, e não podiam mostrar também contra a AMD. Está tudo explicado, pronto. E escolheram os jogos que lhes interessam, tudo explicado. E a resolução 1080p, cuidado. Tá bom, maltinha? Já sabem, se estão com ideias de comprar esta gráfica, também já mostrei os preços. Esperem até eles lançarem os benchmarks oficiais, como deve ser, tá bom? Abraço e até uma próxima. Fui.